Well, hello everyone. You can see us now. This week, you can see us. Yeah, check it out. This is what we look like. Hopefully, you imagined much more attractive people when you were listening. But yes, welcome to another episode of Flashback to the Track on video. We are going to start putting out a video version of the podcast as well as an audio version on YouTube. Just because we have nothing better to do because we're in quarantine and we're all locked down and a lot of us are out of work. So we might as well make some extra videos. So James, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great. It's great being unemployed in America. This is where we hit it with the Rick Springfield cut where it's like I'm a real American.
Yeah.
That's where I feel right now.
Yeah, well, I'm unemployed in Canada, so just applied for my government subsidy today, so hopefully that'll come soon and we'll have some money, but we're doing fine, so not too worried about it. So we're living in strange times. Speaking of strange times, we talk a lot about strange starters, and James and I, we pushed this thing back and forth where we should do like strange starters like Boris said, or strange starters Ron Fellows, and it just became, let's just do strange starters all of the road course ringers, because there is no stranger starters in history than the road course ringers. They're the best and they're our favorites.
Yeah, and it's because we really both watch NASCAR in an era where strange starters like these guys were constantly in the fields for those two road course races that were held every season. And it was so exciting when those races would come up because you would look at the entry list to see who was really going to be on this list, because it would be an eclectic group of drivers, all different backgrounds, very diverse, but one goal in mind, to be the best at driving on the road course, especially in a NASCAR Cup car. So, Mark, I don't know about you, dude, but when I was a very young fan, I probably was a really big Boris Said fan, especially when he was just doing the Cup races. I'd just be like, who said? Boris said.
Yeah, I always wanted Boris to be successful, especially when I watched him on oval tracks. When he would do a few ovals a year, and I'm like, oh God, please get a top 10. This would be amazing.
Yeah,
just a really likable guy, just a really fun guy. And he had the amazing fan group, the Said heads that all wore his, Jufro haircut, wigs, and it was just really, really fun, and obviously, he also threatened to kill Greg Biffle or whatever, or that was hilarious, lots of fun. So he's just a fun driver, and I think all the road course ringers from that era, that are late 90s, early 2000s, are all the ones that I remember the most, and I really love the most. I'm glad I got to watch all those guys race.
Yeah, it was definitely not a strange time, but a really exciting time to see in the sport, because you had this group of drivers that were legitimizing road course racing in NASCAR. I don't know if it was getting lost at that time of how serious it was, but it's always been a serious aspect of NASCAR racing since its inception back in the early 50s. So, I mean, I don't know if we can really coin him as the original road course ringer, but I got to say Dan Gurney's one of those OG guys who would start NASCAR races and was technically very versed in road course races. So I don't know if you agree with that one, Mark.
Yeah, Dan Gurney is interesting. To me, when I did my research, he's the first road course ringer I could come up with. Now, I'm not NASCAR Man or Brock Beard. I don't know what those guys know. I haven't done the research to the level those guys have. All that's available to me is what's on the internet. And I can look at old timesheets and stuff from the early 60s, and I don't know any of those guys on those lists at Riverside, which was I think Riverside was the only road course at that time, from what I remember. They went there twice a year, I think. And the race was actually before the Daytona 500. So the Daytona 500 was not the first race. It was the fifth race in 1963 or 64. Because they actually had
it was the eighth race. So they
had a schedule that started in November, right, of the prior year, and would go in. Yeah.
It would be 55 races long, and I mean, you'd race at tracks in Tampa, and 100-mile race, and you'd have 4 of those 100-mile races, and technically the twin 125s were counted on the schedule. So it was a very crazy time for the schedule, because you would always be constantly racing. But then Mark said, you only had two of these road course races, and they were both out in California, out in the middle of nowhere. So you normally teams would just bring their short track cars, probably. But you get a guy who's as notable as Dan Gurney back then, and you're not just going to bring a short track car. You're going to bring a car that the driver wants to feel comfortable in. So you got to think that Dan Gurney's a guy who worked closely at the time. He was driving for Holman Moody when he first got into NASCAR. He probably worked with Ford and Holman Moody to develop a good car that handled on the left and right hand corners of the racetrack.
Yeah, and Dan, like if you're not familiar with Dan Gurney, like if you're an open wheel fan, like you're probably obviously going to be very, you're gonna understand who Dan Gurney was, and like Dan raced in Formula One. He won in Formula One multiple times, racing for Porsche and for Brabham. He also raced. He also did these NASCAR races, and on top of that, he raced in Trans Am, SCCA. He did everything. He's raced at Le Mans for the Ford program and all kinds of different things in the '60s. And he's really just one of the greatest race car drivers in American history. He's an American hero. Basically, I would say. And he went to Riverside in 1963 with Holman Moody and won the race, led the most laps, won the race. And then he did a bunch of races with the Wood brothers, actually driving the number 121, a 3-digit number. And he won there 4 times with the Wood brothers, led the most laps in all of those races. But Dan's interesting because he didn't just do road courses. He also did a bunch of Daytona 500s. I think he did 3 of them. And he did a race at Atlanta. So he did kind of dabble in other NASCAR on top of just doing the road courses. But James and I were talking about this earlier, and we're kind of like, I think these road course guys, they come and they run some road courses and they like it and they have success. And I'm like, man, I want to try an oval. Like, get me on an oval, because they've never done an oval before. It's just something they want to try out. And, Dan went and did that. But he actually debuted on an oval. His first race was the Daytona 500 in 1962.
Yeah, and that's where people kind of lose track of that, and that's what me and Mark were really talking about. There are drivers who come in and they mainly run road courses in NASCAR, and then those who come in and dabble into NASCAR, and that's what Dan Gurney did. He wanted to come in and experience NASCAR, and there was 2 road course races a year, and they happened to be at Riverside, and they probably were on top of an SCCA weekend or something, so Dan was probably there. And it's interesting you mentioned the Wood brothers too, because his first start with the Wood brothers was in relief, I believe, for a driver in the 121 that year. So it's crazy how he played the game of politics really well. It went from Holman Moody to the Wood brothers, and then ultimately he would finish his career in NASCAR. His final win would come with Petty Enterprises at Riverside. So he was really successful at Riverside, but a notable, probably the most notable of the original road course ringers was Dan Gurney. And then you also have a guy like Mark Donohue too, whose legacy was with Roger Penske, driving that AMC Matador.
Yeah, and I hate to do this, but I gotta be the corrector. He didn't actually win with Petty Enterprises. He finished 6th, but he won the pole.
Oh, he won the
So
pole.
just so people aren't like, you guys don't know what you're talking about. So,
My
but yeah,
bad.
Mark Donohue is one of my favorite race car drivers ever, and he died 15 years before I was born. But just doing my history and reading, like, just Mark Donohue's just incredible. Like, this was such an incredible time for American racing drivers. Like, there were so many amazing American racing drivers, and Mark Donohue was one of them. He won the Indy 500. He raced in Formula One. He had a podium in Formula One back when Penske fielded a team. If you didn't know that, Penske fielded a team in F1 throughout the 70s in multiple events. He won the SCCA runoffs. He did everything. He won several IndyCar races, including the Indy 500. And we do look at him as a road course ringer, but he only made 6 starts in NASCAR altogether. He made 2 starts at Riverside and then 4 ovals. But he did poorly at all of his oval races. But he did win at Riverside in 1973. So I would classify him as a road course ringer.
Well, when you move past the 70s and you move into the 80s, now you start talking about guys like Tommy Kendall. Tommy Kendall, of course, of sports car background, very successful sports car driver. He dabbled in NASCAR, specifically on the road courses, though. So he was not one who dabbled in the ovals as well. So what would we say more about Tommy's career in the road courses of NASCAR?
Well, I think Kendall started out like I remember listening to a podcast with Kendall where he just talked about how it was just something he really wanted to try, and it was really at a time when, if you're not familiar with this, like there was a time in NASCAR, it actually was really up until like the mid 2000s where a lot of guys in the field like were not good on road courses because they only had two of them a year. So teams didn't test, guys didn't spend time getting good on road courses. There were no specialized driving schools that guys went to. And like you didn't see teams hiring Boris Said to teach their drivers how to drive on road courses. They didn't care. It was like two times a year, whatever. We won't worry about it. So a guy like Kendall really saw an opportunity to come in and maybe win a race because he's got this great acumen as a road racer. He's not familiar with the car, but they could test back then. You could go to a test. You could get familiar with a stock car. Obviously, a stock car is a lot heavier than any sports car you're going to drive. Like I think nowadays, what's a cup car weigh? 3,400 pounds, and a GT3 car weighs like 1,400. So it's completely different. But it was an era where he easily, could have got. And this was also an era you could put a guy super good on road courses in like a not very good car and they could be competitive just with because of their racecraft. They could get a good finish. So he drove for Spears Motorsports like in the late 80s in a Buick, like not the best team. And he had like an 18th place finish at Riverside. So he had decent results.
And within the 80s too, you got to look at guys like Dick Johnson who would come in. And Dick Johnson was a Australian touring car driver, 5-time champion of that series. And those cars are much more like sports cars, but in between, I would say a sports car and a stock car. He comes in and he is known as the road course ace. I believe he made a couple starts in that 34 Banquet Foods car, late 80s, early 90s. If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, he actually ran his own team. He entered with
Really?
like his own team. He bought his own stuff. Entered. He only did two road course races. He did Sonoma in I think '89 and Watkins Glen in 1990, and then he ran a bunch of oval races too. So because he raced at Talladega, he wanted to try it out. So he did a bunch of different stuff, and he's a hero in Australia. Like he's one of their greatest sporting legends. So I just pulled up his stats. He ran Pocono, Talladega, the Glen in 1989, as well as Sonoma, and then ran at Darlington, Pocono, and the Glen in 1990. So he was more one of those come over and try and dabble in NASCAR, very much like we saw Marcus Ambrose, another Australian supercars driver champion, come over in the mid 2000s, and he ended up being pretty successful. On road courses especially, but also oval tracks. And we'll talk about Marcus a little bit later, but yeah, Dick Johnson's an interesting one. I didn't really know anything about Dick Johnson until you actually mentioned it to me. And when we
Yeah.
started talking about this, he was the first guy that you mentioned. So I had to look him up and I read all about him. I'm like, man, I kind of want to watch some of these old supercar races if they're online anywhere because it'd be super interesting. He won the Bathurst 1000 three times. So it's
Yeah.
one of the hardest races to win.
It's exactly. That's what's interesting about Dick's career is like he achieved everything he could in Australian motorsports, and then he's like, "Well, I'll go and do NASCAR." Like, why NASCAR? Why did like Australian motorsports translate over to NASCAR? Like that's always baffled me for his career choice. But ever since he got into the sport, you can look at it through old races, especially the two road course races he made starts in. The broadcast coverage was highlighted on him. It was hard not to like the guy when everything's like on him. And it's crazy how like they do interview him like mid race as well. If you watch those races, like Benny Parsons just does not care. And he's a very capable driver to be able to wheel a stock car around and give an interview at pace. So good for Dick Johnson. But then there was a little bit of a black period where there were too many road course ringers, except for there was a another start by Tommy Kendall in the mid '90s, and he drove for Petty Enterprises, if
Yeah,
I'm
he
not
drove
mistaken.
for man, he
And
drove
he
for
drove he
a
drove
lot of
he drove
classic teams.
yeah, he drove for Bill Davis Racing as well, if I'm not mistaken too.
He drove for, let me pull it up. I have his stats right here.
We
He
have
drove
them.
for Rick Hendrick in an
Yes.
extra car one year in a number 18 car for Rick Hendrick. But he had his best finish ever driving for Reno Enterprises in 1990 in the 40 car. He finished eighth at Watkins Glen. He drove for Sabco in the 42 Pontiac. I think that was when Kyle Petty was injured.
Yes.
filled in.
That's yep.
Also drove for Junior Johnson. He filled in for Jimmy Spencer at the Glen. Jimmy Spencer was like notoriously not great on road courses, so he was actually replaced several times throughout his career by road course drivers. He drove for Bill Elliott's team in 1996. He drove for Sabco in '98. So he drove for a lot of like classic NASCAR teams. But it's unfortunately never really had a lot of success. Did Tommy Kendall? He had an eighth place finish, which is kind of cool. But if you watch that race, he's like in the top five the whole race. But that's
And
road
what
courses. You get caught out on like strategy, and you end up finishing like 30th. When you led a good portion of the race. So
and that's a huge part of road course racing is like understanding when to come and pit and have that strategy to where you are now at the front of the pack where everyone else is behind you and you're good to go to the finish. And it's about racing those around you for position. And it seemed like every time that Tommy Kendall came to Watkins Glen, he was always in the top five because of his strategy. He always had like a good team to employ good strategy. And he, to me, is like one of those consistent ringers again. You're seeing another guy who comes in and he's specifically coming in for the two road course races that were in the 90s, Watkins Glen and Sonoma. And due to some circumstances, especially with Bill Elliott being injured, he got to drive at Sonoma and Watkins Glen. Kyle Petty being injured, he got to drive at Watkins Glen. I mean, he's proven to be a very talented driver. I mean, he even drove for Alan Kowicki's team in 1993, I believe, when Kowicki's team was just like bought out and it was like had Family Channel on the car and it was all white. That was he was always good, but for some reason just it never panned out for him to claim the victory in a cup race. So, but Kendall to me was one of those ringers again because during the 90s we started to see a surgence of sports car and open wheel drivers that came in to dabble in NASCAR. We're talking about guys like Ron Fellows, Scott Pruitt, and Boris Said. These guys were coming in and they wanted to be NASCAR drivers, and they were driving full time in specific series.
Yeah, I think Boris Said is the good one to start with. So like Boris started out in NASCAR in the Truck Series, and I think really came to NASCAR with the intention of being a full-time driver. He started out, he ran Sonoma in the Truck Series in '95, ran a couple more races in '96 for Ernie Irvin's team, or Irvin Simo Racing, part owned by Mark Simo and Brian Simo. Is it Simo or Simo? I don't know. I'm just going to say Simo.
I've heard it pronounced both ways, so
I'm going to pronounce it both ways, just multiple times. But he ran full time in trucks in '97 and '98. He got his only truck win in '98. It was on a road course. But he had some good runs at oval tracks, man. He has like a second at Texas, fourth at New Hampshire. So, he had some good runs. And then unfortunately in '99, he had to go back to part-time with the team. Won a couple poles. He won the pole at Portland. He won the pole at Topeka, a couple road courses. And really never got to progress any farther than that as a full-time driver in NASCAR, and then sort of relegated back to being a road course ringer for a lot of years. He drove for Jimmy Spencer's team. He drove for Jasper Motorsports, and he would run Sonoma and Watkins Glen. But the interesting thing about all these ringers is like how they got these rides. So like he filled in Jasper in 2001 because Robert Presley was so far out in points and he just wasn't very good on road courses. So they just were like, oh, I'll just put Boris in the car for these two races. And then they fielded an extra car for him in 2002. 2003, he runs at the 01 Army car because Jerry Nadeau was injured, and he won the pole at Sonoma. So he's actually in the Bud Shootout in 2004, which is sick. But then he raced at the Glen. Then he stayed on with MB2 in an extra car for a bunch of years, started his own team, and like he just bounced around, always filling in and doing different things. But the cool thing, as we mentioned earlier, is Boris actually ran quite a few oval races. Well, I'll say quite a few, 3 or 4 a year for a number of years. In 04, 05, 06, 07, he did run like Daytona. He has a couple starts in the Daytona 500, and he has a pole at Daytona. In 2006, he won the pole for the Pepsi 400, and he finished 4th. So that's pretty cool, and that's his best oval finish in NASCAR.
Well, for the Cup Series, he's a very versatile driver too, and not only that, being a versatile driver and being a very knowledgeable driver on road courses means you can coach other drivers. He was a driver coach for basically every Cup Series driver throughout the 2000s. people would lean on Boris to get better at road course racing, which will lead to the future. We'll tie that all together really nicely a little bit later on. But you talk about being a versatile driver. Boris was always good at playing the game too, as being like that guy to know everyone in the garage area. I mean, in 2006, he was a driver coach for Aaron Crocker and actually was able to run Xfinity races for Evernham Motorsports, which to me was interesting. I thought that was weird when you saw Boris Said in the number 9 car. And then you had moments where he was in Cup with the 36 team for MB2. Then he had his own team the next year. He was just always able to get to the track and be able to be on track. And he was in pretty decent equipment for a number of years. And then towards the later half of his career in the 2010s, it just was just getting by and he was making his starts. But unfortunately, it wasn't the lust wasn't there where he could win almost at any start he made. But then you look at a guy who came at the same time as him, Ron Fellows, 1997 Truck Series, man. A lot of great drivers from that year. Ron Fellows came in and he started his first race on an oval at Texas and kind of went down the same path as Boris, except he never got to run full time.
Yeah, he's an interesting one where, I think because of his ties with being a GM driver, also like Ron Fellows is like my favorite driver ever. Other than I really like Robbie Gordon. He's always my favorite driver, but Ron Fellows is like from 20 minutes away from where I live. He's a Canadian hero. He should be on our $5 bill. Like he's a hero. Everybody loves Ron Fellows. All right. He's the owner of Canadian Tire Motorsports Park. Like he's a champion. And I think he really, he's always raced for Chevy his entire NASCAR career. And he's always been, he wasn't always aligned with Chevy throughout his whole career. He did drive for Ford in Trans Am in the 80s and early 90s. But he came in with Hess Racing and the number 48 Chevy and trucks, ran at Texas, ran at Topeka, and then he won the race at Watkins Glen from the pole. And yeah, folks, there was a time when the Truck Series went to 3 road courses a year, and they should do that again. It's really stupid that they only go to 1, by the way. And then he ran for them in 98. Again, got a top 10 at Texas. He got a 7th place finish at Texas, won the pole at the Glen again, and then moved on to Nemco. So he actually drove for Joe Nemechek's team in 99 and 2000 and won another race at Watkins Glen in 1999 for Joe Nemechek's team. And then he started this run of dominance in the Busch Series as well in the late 90s. So he won in the 4 Busch races in 98, 99, 2000, 2001. He won 3 of them and finished second once and won the pole twice. So he dominated Watkins Glen in the early 2000s and late 90s, driving for Joe Nemechek. So absolutely just dominant driver. Funny that all those wins came at Watkins Glen. But then he also drove in the Cup Series. So he had a lot of Cup races, all for so many different teams. Again, just knowing how to play the game and getting these rides with different teams, right? Making those connections with guys like Joe Nemechek who are going to give you a ride. Finished second at the Glen in 1999 in a Cup car for Nemechek, which is shocking because Nemechek's Cup team was never super competitive.
No, the Cup team never was, but his Xfinity and truck program was stellar, especially his Xfinity program. And I think what it was is you have a really great car like Ron did have with Nemco. They built this beautiful car that was so capable, and it was probably just purpose built for Watkins Glen. And you look at a guy like Ron Fellows who races at Watkins Glen and other divisions as well. He understands that track. So, I mean, for his run of dominance there, it's just probably a perfect storm of just understanding the car and the track. But he played the game really well, and I think a big thing he played well was his loyalty to General Motors, because it leads to him also getting the opportunity to run at DEI as well later on in the early 2000s, because there was that unfortunate 2003 season where there was 5 drivers in the one car during 1 year. Geez. And yeah. Ron was lucky enough to get to drive that car twice. And he drove it in 2004, I believe, as well. I think that was his last start with DEI.
Yeah, he drove at the Glen in 2004, finished second. He actually led a bunch of laps and had a strategy to win that race. And I think it was a speeding penalty on pit road or some sort of pit stop problem that
Mm-hmm.
put him at the back. And he burned his tires up getting back up to second, and he just didn't have enough to run Tony Stewart down. Like, man, it's almost like if he'd had like 5 laps fresher tires, he probably would have won that race. And it's a shame that he never won a cup race. Like he came so close so many times. And a few years ago, I wrote an article for sportsbreak.com, and it was like 20 best drivers that never win a cup race, and I put him at 20 because I was like, I know he only ever made like 20 starts his whole career, but I'm like, come on, he came so close so many times.
And that's the thing. It's like you look at drivers like like Tommy Kendall, who came close a couple of times, but I mean Ron Fellows finished second. It's a very disappointing second. And then the other time that he was fast in the '87 Nemco car, I mean he had quick pace, but I mean he didn't have the longevity, endurance car to basically make it to the finish. And unfortunately, I mean he never won a cup race, which is kind of disappointing because he had a lot of good opportunities. Unfortunately, he didn't have a great opportunity when he was driving the Tide Ride. Though strategy puts you in a good position to uh, ultimately fight for the win, and I think that's something that he did really well in the 32 car. Is he played really well? He played well with the strategy, and he played into his hand. I mean, another thing with Ron too is he was able to have a really good relationship with Junior Motorsports because I
I
think a
think
lot
it's that friendship with Dale
yeah.
Earnhardt, right? Yeah.
And not only that, the ties with Chevrolet. I mean, he is one of the few drivers to really stick close to a manufacturer like he did. Maybe tags with Dodge nowadays, but I mean, geez, Ron Fellows and Chevrolet is just hand in hand. It's like maple syrup and pancakes. You need two to
Exactly.
go together.
And yeah, he drove for Kevin Harvick's team in Xfinity too. Like when they came back, because the Xfinity series didn't go to road courses from '02 to '04. They came back in '05 with Mexico and Watkins Glen. So he drove for Nemco again in Mexico, which was really cool, and had like a mechanical failure, but he was running really well in that race. Then he drove for Kevin Harvick's team for a couple years, and then he started driving for Junior Motorsports for the rest of his career. And he raced till 2013. And the cool thing is, in like 2012, he had top fives at all 3 road courses. But his best moment, obviously, I think in this time is at Montreal in 2008. So Montreal in 2008, it was the first ever NASCAR race to get run during in the rain.
Mm-hmm.
It started raining halfway through the race. They had to put rain tires on. Everyone was flipping out about how nobody could drive because it was so bad. And Ron Fellows just masterfully whooped everyone because he's like, I have experience driving in the rain because I've driven in the rain at Le Mans, and this is no big deal to me. So he got the lead. Eventually, they had to red flag it. There was too much rain on the racetrack, and they gave him the win, which is amazing. Like we have these things. You've probably never heard of them because you're not Canadian, but we had these like public commercials that used to run, and there's like 50 or 60 of them, and they're these heritage minutes where they're like these reenactments of like parts of Canadian history, and they were paid for by the government, and they would run like during commercials on TV, where it'd be like the Vikings discovering Newfoundland, or like the Avro Arrow airplane, or the invention of Superman, because I guess the guy who thought of Superman was Canadian, and they're amazing. You should look them up on YouTube. There should be one for this race, okay? Like Ron Fellows winning on the island in Montreal in the pouring rain, being a Canadian driver to win on Canadian soil in NASCAR is just the coolest thing ever. So to me, I think that's really his greatest victory of any of his other races. Like that probably meant more to him than winning Le Mans or winning anything else. Winning that race in Montreal. So it was great.
Doing it for Canada. I mean,
Exactly.
Montreal also played host to Boris Said's drag race of a victory. Man, that was a good one against Max Pappas, I
In
believe.
his like unsponsored like '09 like
Zaxby's on the
RAB
hood.
racing car. Yeah, that was amazing, man. Like what a
Desperate to
weird
make the season happen, man.
that was a weird race too. NASCAR, go back to Montreal. Every single one of those races was a banger. They were all amazing. There were no bad races at Montreal.
The biggest thing I actually remember from the 2008 race was that moment when Carl Edwards had his squeegee outside of his window trying to
He's trying to
squeegee
squeegee
the
off.
humidity off of it. Or
That was amazing, man. It was awesome. Like just like the fact that they just gave him that to like go like that, it was just ridiculous.
I'm
But
I wanted to see all the apparatuses all the teams put together for their drivers. Um, and then finally, from that 3 drivers that we mentioned, Scott Pruitt. First off, hi to his family at home. Hope they're
yeah,
doing great.
how do your family at home Scott. I interviewed Scott Pruitt at the Rolex 24 this year, and I really should have got him to say that. I really wanted to do it, but I didn't want to piss him off. So I didn't bother, but man, it was hilarious. And then afterwards, the Lexus people were like, he probably would have done it. He thinks it's funny. I'm like, damn. Like, nice
Damn.
guy. He was
Yeah.
wearing his Rolex from I can't remember what year it was from, but he was wearing one of his watches.
Flexing, huh? So Scott Pruitt from karting background. Interesting to know. A lot of people forget that he drove in kart and had a pretty decent career in kart. Uh, his most notable entry into NASCAR probably was in 2000 when he drove for PPI in the Tide Ride, number 32. Very unsuccessful season, I gotta say, Mark.
Yeah, his only top 10 was at Indianapolis, actually, not at a road course. He finished 10th at Indy.
That's right.
So,
Hollow
yeah,
ground.
he had a couple DNQs as well. Like, he had no experience in a stock car. And they were like, you could be a full-time cup driver.
Yeah, you don't really see that happen
Yeah.
too much. I mean,
No,
maybe,
you saw it
maybe
a lot in like 2008.
and that was going to be my point was like
Yeah,
maybe it's the resume.
yeah,
The resume
exactly.
is like, yeah, you could drive a stock car, sure. No,
But
not,
he had won on an
no
oval
offense.
in kart. He won at Michigan in kart in 1995. So
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, it's like the whole adage is from Days of Thunder, where it's like the car was weighed half as much and the tire was twice as wide. Now you get the car weighs twice as much and tires half as wide. So
yeah, it didn't go well.
yeah,
I can't. His average finish was 30 something. He failed to qualify for 6 races, including Watkins Glen, which I think was rained out that year.
yeah, and that's unfortunate because back then, it was very important to have like a road course ringer for qualifying, so you could make the show because there was a lot of cars attempting to make the show. Unfortunately, when you got your driver in there who's going to probably make the show for you very far back in points and you don't have any points, you're not going to make it. So that kind of was one of those situations that all these road course ringers have to fight every time they qualify is you never know. You're not guaranteed a spot in the show. So uh, he we don't see Scott Pruitt until 2001. And I'm going to assume it's going to be at the road course races. And I'm going to assume because he knows how to play the game real well, it's going to be with a good owner, maybe like a Chip Ganassi.
Yeah, so he runs Sonoma with Andy Petrie in a one-off, and then
Oh,
starts this amazing run with Chip Ganassi driving. He drove Jason Leffler's car at Watkins Glen
mm-hmm.
in '01 just because Jason was just not didn't have the road course acumen, and they needed to qualify for that race, so they put
Yeah.
Scott in the car and they actually put Leffler in a second car, like just to try and make it just for his driver points, and he didn't qualify. So it's a good thing they replaced him. Pruitt finished 11th. He ran top 10 all day. Finished
Mm-hmm.
11th, had a great run, and then he just like it's just Chip Ganassi or a Chip Ganassi affiliated team for like the rest of his career in NASCAR because he was also driving for them in Grand Am. So because Chip Ganassi has IndyCar teams, Grand Am teams, IMSA teams, NASCAR teams, like so he was like, I'll just get in this organization and then I'll always be able to drive, you know. And this was back when the economics of racing were different. You could field teams could afford to field an extra car. They had the money, they had the sponsorship, especially with like all the money that Target was giving Chip Ganassi. They started fielding Scott Pruitt in an extra car in '03 and '04. They ran the 39 car. And man, he almost won the Glen and Sonoma a couple times. Like he had a couple of top fives. And then they used him as a fill in guy after that. So 2005, it was a really interesting scenario where qualifying was rained out at the Glen. So he didn't qualify in his 39 car because they didn't have any points. But Sterling Marlin's father died. So he went to go take care of the arrangements. So Scott Pruitt drove his car and finished fourth after having to start at the back. And then in '06, he filled in for David Stremme because they were so low in points. They put him in the car instead. And the same thing in '08. He filled in for Reed Sorensen because they were so low in points. So really just like he was like Chip Ganassi's ace in the hole, man. He was like, oh, we're low in points. Bah, Scott Pruitt. No problem. We'll put Scott Pruitt in there, you know? So, and no, he never won in NASCAR, though, is the only thing about
No.
Scott. He never managed to win a race at any level in NASCAR. He does have
He
a
should
couple
have
poles.
Yeah. I mean, he should have won at Mexico in '07. I'm just saying, to be dumped by your teammate, that's pretty low, dirty driving.
Yeah, I'd have done the same
Yeah.
thing though. If I was Juan Pablo Montoya, I'd have
Yeah,
turned
you
him
would have.
around. I'd
Yeah.
have been like, "Yep, I'm getting this win." So yeah,
I'm
Juan
gonna have
Pablo Montoya.
nightmare about juicy fruit if I don't dump him.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and he got the pole at Montreal as well in '08. He had a couple top fives in Xfinity. So he did, he had an okay career as a ringer. I think really serviceable driver. Um, and he has the great stat ever. He's 1 for 1 in 24 hours of Le Mans. He ran one time in 2001 with Ron Fellows as his teammate with Johnny O'Connell, and they won. They won it. So
Mic
one,
drop. I'm done. I don't need to come back to Le Mans anymore. I'm good. Well, and you think too about Scott, it's more than just an okay career as a ringer. That's very successful because he was able to align himself with a good owner to always have good equipment. He was never just driving around in like whatever car on these road course races. And he kind of was developing what would, like Boris said, like Ron Fellows, developing what would become the future NASCAR drivers. These drivers who were not only great drivers on ovals, but very serviceable on road courses. I mean, NASCAR drivers nowadays really know how to road race. It's not where it was, 10, 15 years ago, where you needed to have this ringer almost in place by Daytona because you knew when the road course races came around that you needed to have a guy like this in your car to get a good finish. And even like through the mid 2000s too, you kind of saw it with like past champions coming back as ringers because of their abilities. Guys like a Terry Labonte would come back and run road course races kind of as this ringer because he had the past champions provisional to almost lock himself into the show, but he was also a very decent driver. But there were very few and far between uh, through the NASCAR drivers through the years that were really great road course racers.
yeah, it's interesting. Like we were talking about this earlier. Like in the '90s, there really were. Like I was talking to my wife about this actually because she was a big Rusty Wallace fan when she was a kid because her dad liked Rusty. Her dad just liked Fords. Like he would just cheer. He still just cheers for Fords.
Go Blue
So
Ovals!
yeah, he loves because
Unite!
I guess he owned a Mustang when he was a kid. When he was in high school. So
Was it a Fox body?
yeah, I don't remember. All I know is he hates all the Mustangs from the late '90s, early 2000s. He hates them.
Okay.
But he was a big Ford guy, so she was a Rusty Wallace fan, and she's like, I don't remember more than like one or two guys winning road course races in the '90s. I'm like, it's true, man. It was like Jeff Gordon, Ricky
Mark
Rudd,
Martin.
Mark Martin, or like Rusty Wallace. Like nobody else would ever win on road course, man. Like Mark
Yep.
Martin owned Watkins Glen for like 3 straight years. Like no one could even touch him there. Like he was so good. And then we get into like the 2000s when the ringers really start to show up. And then they gave those full-time cup guys like a run for their money at a lot of those early 2000s races. And then we see it was Jeff Gordon, Tony Stewart, and they were really like the two every year that would win. And then Robbie Gordon started winning. He won both races in '03.
Yep.
And it was just incredible to watch those guys run, like it. But nowadays, I'd say half the field has a decent chance of winning on a road course. Like there's
Yep.
really isn't the way the cars drive now. I don't really think there are guys who are. Do you see the same guys in the top 10 at every road course? Like I don't think so. I think it's pretty much of a mix now. Like it's interesting. Like did guys just grow up with it more now, or did Boris Said really like make himself obsolete by teaching everyone else how to drive on road courses? You know,
I think partially that, and partially like you also did state. I think drivers grew up with it more, to a point too. Because I mean, even look at the schedule in the Xfinity series. I mean, that's got 3 road course races. You scale it back further down to the K&N series, or now ARCA. Back when it was like K&N for a few seasons, there were a lot of road course races like Road America, Lime Rock. You had Road Atlanta. You had Laguna Seca. There have been a lot of races on road courses in the developmental series that you have to go through that make you have to appreciate and learn this a little bit. And I think so too. I think drivers, they come through different backgrounds, but everyone starts in go-karts nowadays. And when you're running go-karts, it's running a road course. So from a very young point, I think a lot of drivers learn it, but you know, you can always sim it, you can always test it. But then again, I I think also the gap of performance has shrunken a lot. I feel like all these cars that go to road courses now are very comparable to each other. They're very competitive. They're not there's not that much of a gap between first and fifth. Now I think the gap is between first and 25th. Anyone in between those first 25 cars, if they play the right strategy, and keep it clean and on the track, yeah, they can win the race. So I think it's a crapshoot, but also it's understanding the odds. And I think a guy that does it really well right now is, of course, Chase Elliott.
Mhm.
Martin Truex Jr. does it really well as well.
He always has, yeah. And Kyle Busch,
Yeah,
Kyle
Kyle
Busch is
Busch.
so good on road courses too. And he
Yeah.
didn't start out that way, but another
Nope.
guy who I believe went to the Boris said school of road course driving and learned how to be a good road course driver. So, because when he was back at Hendrick, he was not really a very strong road course driver in his early
No.
career. And then now, I think in '08, he won both road courses. So he
Well,
really turned it around.
you look at like you said, the board said school of driving. You look at his alliance. Then he comes into Toyota. He drove for Red Bull too for a little bit. Got that Monster affiliation. So he probably kind of had some way to tie it back to Kyle, and it kind of paid forward for him. So um, it probably helps a guy like Boris said survive and get the opportunities to race more if like you teach these guys to do. It's not that you're necessarily taking yourself out of a job. It's more or less you're finding a needs to survive. Um, and that's the game. It's surviving in NASCAR. Boris said could go get a sports car right easily. He could go and drive anything in that realm of motorsports. But to be in NASCAR, you have to kind of evolve yourself to be able to open your self up to opportunities like this.
Yeah, man. And he was still racing like is he still racing Trans Am? I saw him race Trans Am like 2 years
I
ago.
think, and everyone's racing Trans Am. Trans
It was
Am's a
like
hot ticket.
he was in a
Yeah.
Monster Energy Dodge in
Yep.
Trans Am. So yeah, and I was just gonna ask you, James, like, what are some of your favorite? Now we've kind of gone over like the classic road course ringers. Like, there's been other ones too who have run a lot of races. Guys like Brian Simo, who part owned Boris Head's team. He actually finished in the top 10 for Richard Childress one time in an extra car. Um, and Chris Cook, he owns a driving school at Sonoma, and he's run a bunch of races for various teams, including Joe Nemechek. Andy Lally, Max Pappas, who ended up doing full-time Cup, full-time trucks.
Another person that aligns themselves very well with people. He's aligned himself really well with the Dillons and Richard Childress Racing to stay not only relevant, but to keep himself within the loop of things and in the sport more. And he's really smart with that. And he's also been a really smart businessman too with the MPI brand and company he has. Uh, Basically, that has wheels everywhere. It's crazy that he has that kind of reach within that company. But
Now he's
Tagliani.
an IndyCar race steward now, Max
Oh, really?
Pappas.
Oh, Max Pappas is everywhere. Jeez.
Yeah.
Your man Tagliani, a guy could never win a race for some reason.
Alex Tagliani, man, straight baller. Love Alex Tagliani. I didn't put Patrick Carpentier on here. He did start as a ringer, but then decided to be a full-time Cup driver because there was this year in 2008 where every former open wheel driver was like, I'm going to go race in the Cup Series with no experience. And
It was
didn't work out well for many of them. So
it was honestly the best time because it was just such a trial by fire era of like, oh
there
man,
was no driver development. It was just like, boom, Cup, let's go. Like there
you
was
know,
no like, we'll start you out in the trucks and we'll move you up. There was no time for that. There was
oh there
money
was
on the line.
Montoya had a handful of Arca, Xfinity, and one Cup start
Well,
before
so
his
so
full
did
season.
Franchitti. He had a Busch race at Memphis. It's like great. That'll get you ready for the Daytona 500. Like,
Oh,
uh,
another one too. You got to look at is a Christian Fittipaldi because Christian Fittipaldi was also a little bit of a ringer, but he was full time. He did make a start for Andy Petrie Racing, and then he kind of did a little bit of oval stuff for Andy Petrie. Then he did obviously the most infamous petty roll when he had that crash in 2003 at Watkins Glen on the foam, and he just like gently rolled over. Uh, but it's interesting too with the title of ringer because like you look at drivers like Robbie Gordon, which is always brought up. A guy like Robbie Gordon, how is he not a road course ringer?
because he's a full-time Cup driver. Like, he ran so many full-time seasons in Cup, and he's won a Cup race on an oval. So I don't think he won his first Cup race on an oval. So can you really call him a ringer. Like I think you made a good point when we were talking that the only time Robbie Gordon was a ringer was in 2001 at Sonoma, where
Yep.
he got hired in a one-off ride to win that race. It was
Hmm.
like, we're gonna put you in the best car on planet Earth that we could come up with, and you're gonna win this thing. And he would have if he just let Kevin Harvick have his lap back. He would have won that race. And it's like, but you know what? That's Robbie Gordon.
Hey man,
He's
that's why he passed him in 2003 under caution. It's like, oh, you wanted your lap back, right? Now I get to pass you for the lead, and that was fair.
and people say that that pass was controversial. It was legal.
It was
Like
legal.
what? It's perfectly legal.
Well, I mean, there
It
is a
was
gentleman.
unsportsmanlike, but it was
Yeah,
legal. Like
it was.
what?
It wasn't in the confines of the gentleman's agreement, no, but it was not illegal. The other aspect too about that is, yeah, a ringer is mainly designated or hired to run the road courses. They can dabble and do these other things, but when they become full time and their desire is to run the full schedule and focus on everything that is NASCAR, they're not really the full NASCAR driver 100% of the way. I feel like that's kind of where we're trying to go with it. I mean, we're not trying to discredit anybody because everybody was very successful in their careers, but to label someone a ringer, I feel like you need to have some more context to what they're doing and what they were trying to do when they were driving at that time. Because there's a lot of moments where Boris said is not a road course ringer uh, early in his career, but later on he becomes a ringer. It's just the way the
Yeah, and
way.
I really think like the definition of ringer is like when you bring someone in who has a specific skill set for a certain event. It's
Yeah.
like when you're playing like 5-on-5 like flag football tournaments and there's that one team that has like who the one girl's boyfriend who played football in college, and they brought him in for just the tournament. So because he's super good. And like that's really dumb and don't do that. That's really unsportsmanlike. But in NASCAR, it doesn't matter because there's money on the line and trophies. So we can bring in a ringer. And most of the time, it would be we're fielding an extra car for one of these guys, or we're going to replace one of our full season drivers. And it just made sense to bring somebody in with the ability. Unfortunately, we've seen the death of the road course ringer over time due to the playoff system and the charter system. It just doesn't make sense to replace a guy for a race now. But they still exist in Xfinity and in trucks to a certain extent. In rides that have multiple drivers. Like last year, we saw Andy Lally at the
Mhm.
Xfinity races. We saw Jack Hawksworth at Mid Ohio, which was awesome. He won a stage, qualified second. He'd never driven a stock car before. Found out he was going to run that race Tuesday of that week, and so that was really cool. So we still see them. And Justin Marks, I think you could say he always ran a lot of ovals, but I think you could say he was a ringer. His only ever win came at Mid Ohio. And then he ended up doing like full time IMSA, and he's won a 24 Hours of Daytona. So he's always really been a road course guy.
Mhm.
And Michael McDowell too. Look at Michael McDowell. His only win ever came at Road America in Xfinity for Richard Childress, and he's a full time Cup driver. But man, I'm more looking at him as a restrictor plate guy now. Though he's so good at Daytona and Talladega.
He's a
He
plate
doesn't
specialist.
kind of, but he started out on road courses too. And but are those guys really ringers? Is the thing. But we got AJ Allmendinger now doing the ringer thing. He was a full time driver, but he's kind of transitioned now into being a ringer. He only does the road courses and the super speedways. That's it. Because I think he really only wants to run the racetracks now at this point in his career where he knows he has an opportunity to win. For him, it's tough to win at Texas or Bristol, but he knows he's got a chance to win at Daytona or Watkins Glen if he's in a really good car.
Yeah, and I think we kind of raise another point too, because you look at back in the 2000s when there were consistently a large number of ringers starting cup races, you never saw any of them winning. It was always Tony Stewart, Jeff Gordon, and I think a problem with the Cup Series was you have, and this is every series, every division, you have to consistently be there to be a contender. And even so, it's hard for a guy like AJ Allmendinger to go in there constantly and win. Luckily, the team he runs with does run the full schedule, so he's at least with a team that is gelled and understands the rhythm of a weekend. But he still has to get in that rhythm. He needs to be there, and that's hard for a driver to do in a one-off event in these situations, though he's proven himself last year at the Roval. And there's a lot of other drivers too who constantly do it in the Xfinity series, and I feel like it's a good thing to do that in the Xfinity and the Truck series to kind of keep it fresh. But I wish there would be more of that in the trucks in the Cup series. But it's I don't know. The road races have really lost their lust because of that. You know, this competition, this exotic competition, more or less, of drivers from different backgrounds coming in and encroaching on the territory of the Cup Series for victory. It's a lost art. It's lost time.
I used to really look forward to it. The road races. I really did. And now I just don't anymore because there isn't that there's those interesting storylines aren't there anymore in the Cup Series. I still
Yeah.
love it in Xfinity. Like I love when they go to Mid Ohio and there's 5 or 6 like sports car guys in the field. And that's really cool. And just to see the different strategies guys play. But unfortunately, with stages being added now, the road course races don't have strategy anymore. Not like they used to. Like, it used to be it was 90 laps at Watkins Glen, and this is the plan, and we're gonna run this strategy. We're gonna do a 3-stop. We're gonna do a 2-stop. But we need to get 8 laps of caution. And everyone says, well, fuel mileage is boring. No, those early 2000s Watkins Glen races were always exciting, and they
Yep.
were almost always won on strategy calls. There's rarely ever like a last lap battle. And now I get that we've gotten that recently, like 2011 or 12 it was with Ambrose and Keselowski. Like that was really cool, but
Yep.
those strategy wins were always exciting. Like I think when Robbie Gordon won in '03, like that was purely on strategy. It was like having a fuel, like is this going to work out? And it did, and they won, and it was exciting to watch, and same thing at Sonoma. We saw Ambrose run out of fuel under caution in 2010. He had the opportunity to win that race, and they ran out of fuel. And '07, Montoya stretched fumes for like 5 laps to win that race, and I love that. We don't get that really anymore because the stage breaks have kind of ruined that part of it.
Well, to me, I look at races like Park 2000 when he beats Mark Martin. You see the underdog guy who plays the strategy just right, beats the other guy who's got a faster car, but it's all about timing. Um, but a close finish like that, you look at Robbie Gordon, who has to drive through the field in 2005 to finish second to Tony Stewart. Drive through the field. It's crazy how um, many cars he passed and how off sequence he was to get the track position that he had to try to contend with Tony in that race. There's a lot of these other stories that you see in road course races that are kind of gone. Um, Strategy does add excitement because it allows you to enjoy the entire race. Though, like you've said, Mark, like Keselowski and Ambrose in 2011 was exciting and interesting, but if you want to judge the race off the last 2 laps, then yeah, that's the finish you need. If you want to judge the race off the entire product as a whole, strategy calls and long enduring races that road courses bring you are really exciting and really entertaining. There's a lot of attrition too in a road course race, and I think that's something that's exciting. And it could be attrition due to incident, or it's an accident, or it could be a mechanical failure, or it just could be attrition due to over driving and overstepping the boundaries of the track. And that's the other aspects you don't see talked about with road course racing as much, and it kind of loses lust, if you ask me.
Yeah, I agree with you, man. I think it's just not like what it once was, and I think you're always gonna look back at the racing you watched when you were in high school and think it was the best. I think
Oh yeah.
always, and those like Gen 4 era of road course racing was always incredible. They drove a lot more like sports cars, and now the car is just so different. And I hope we get back to that with the new car. With this brand new car, we're gonna have this Gen 7 car with the sequential shifter, and they're trying to make it more like V8 supercars. And if you're listening to this and you've never watched a V8 supercars race, watch one because it is some of the best racing you'll ever see in your life.
Oh
I
yeah.
watched the before sports were canceled. I got to watch the qualifying shootout for their debut race. The problem is with these races to watch them live, they're on at like 3 in the morning here. But I watched the qualifying shootout, and that was more exciting than half the NASCAR races last year. Their top 10 qualifying shootout. It was unbelievable. It was sick. Like, I was like, man, we
Oh,
got
he's
to
going
do
to set
more.
fastest time now. Here comes
Yeah.
come through the bottom.
And
It's
then they
like,
like let one guy out for his out lap when the other guy's on his hot lap, and it's like one lap you got to go, and it's amazing. It's just super interesting, and I wish NASCAR would kind of take more of that stuff, and they're great spectator events, but we'll see what ends up happening. But I'll ask you this, James. Let's kind of wrap back and forth on just what's some of your favorite road course ringer moments that you remember.
um, I think one that always gets me was the Mexico races were always interesting. Probably '07 when Montoya and Pruitt got together. I mean, Montoya was a ringer in that situation, but also a guy trying to get experience, trying to gain more time in a stock car. And you got Pruitt, who truly was a ringer and a veteran in the stock car. Got taken out by his teammate. And I loved Mexico City. I thought it was always an interesting race. But I think the clout of that race was bigger because you had this international star in Juan Pablo Montoya coming in, and it was almost like the Mexico crowd became his home crowd in that race. That was always a great moment to see that energy. Man, I always loved Boris Said driving cars, but I always loved Boris Said's antics. He always seemed to get into it with somebody. Early on in his career, he got into it with Biffle at Watkins Glen. He got into it with who was it, Brett Bodine at Sonoma in 2001, and then he just got into Biffle again later on in his career. Those were always entertaining because it would always add more action to what would happen post race, because post race can get boring at times, especially on a road course. If you think about it, Mark, in 2004, Ron Fellows scared the shit out of Tony Stewart technically in Victory Lane because Tony did defecate himself in Victory Lane after the race.
That's right. I
What?
remember. I remember
Yeah.
that. I remember hearing
Not,
about
not
that.
not to bring the bad memories up, Tony. I just you got to think about it. Ron Fellows drove the crap out of you.
It's true. Yeah, when
It's
Ron's in
very
your rearview
true.
mirror, he's coming. I
What
think
about you, Mark?
my favorite ones, like, um, I really love if you go back and you watch the 2001 Xfinity race at Watkins Glen when Ron Fellows wins. Just like the excitement in his voice when he's driving around like the last couple corners is just incredible. Like how happy he is to win that race. And I feel like I said it earlier, like I feel like his wins in NASCAR were just the most important wins to him. Like they meant
Mhm.
more than anything because it really showed that he could come in and just whoop everyone who does this on a weekly basis. So it's just really cool. And that one, and Boris said one I really like is there was 2 years in a row where at the Glen, Boris said DNQ'd and then got in a different car for the race. So in '07, his team didn't have enough points when qualifying got rained out. So Bill Elliott was like, whatever, you can drive the Wood Brothers car because I'm not interested. So he drove the Wood Brothers car. And in '08, the same thing happened again. And Kyle Petty gave him his car and he drove Kyle Petty's car instead. So it's just kind of cool that like they liked him so much. They were like, you know what? You can drive my car. I'll sit this one out. That and little known in '07, Marcus Ambrose was supposed to drive a number 77 car for Robbie Gordon Motorsports at Watkins Glen, and he was
Yep.
one of the fastest cars in practice. And qualifying got rained out, and he didn't qualify. And that was a apology from Robbie Gordon from the week before for running Marcus off the track at Montreal when Gordon had been black flagged. Completely wrong by NASCAR. If you watch the race, like he got robbed, man. Like the fix was on for that race. Like it was ridiculous. Well, I will never say a race is fixed, but NASCAR got the ruling wrong. If you watch the replays, like they shouldn't have. Robbie Gordon won that race.
There's
Like
a lot of conspiracy theories against
yeah,
NASCAR, making calls against Robbie Gordon that shouldn't have ever been made. Atlanta 2005.
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't see the video from that as inconclusive. I don't see him throwing roll bar padding out his window. It's inconclusive. Like you can't say that he did
There's
it.
just a black dot that happens to go across the screen right when the camera picks up the 7 car. I can't tell what it is.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's
Inconclusive.
interesting. But yeah, so that was cool. It would have been awesome to see what Marcus would have done in a second Robbie Gordon Motorsports car on the road course because Robbie finished top 5 in that race. So it would have been interesting to see. Maybe fuck Marcus might have won the pole. Who knows? Like he was really fast in practice. So that was an interesting one that I thought was kind of cool, even though it didn't end up happening. Trying to think of some other ones. I think those are really my favorites. watching some of the early truck races, like when we talked about that race at Portland in '99. That truck race was just awesome.
Yeah, there's not many ringers in that race. I mean, obviously you have Ron Fellows, who's a ringer though, and then you have a lot of great Truck Series regulars who come from such diverse backgrounds that some of them have like road course experience, and it just adds to the field of drivers and the competition that race presents for the fans. So I'm trying to think of a really cool starter that I could remember other than
Do you remember Kenny Habul?
yeah, Kenny Hubble and the Sun Energy car.
Kenny
Sun
Habul,
Energy.
the part owner and investor in Sun Energy, who is like, if you don't know who Kenny Habul is, he's actually a pretty decent like gentleman driver in like sports cars. Like he's actually pretty good. He's pretty fast. And he actually came to NASCAR with his own team at first. He got his own team together, and then ended up driving for Joe Gibbs and Junior Motorsports.
Yep.
Never really had any success, but he wanted to try it on the road courses. And I think he actually ran Martinsville once in a truck. So that was kind of cool to see. But yeah, he's actually a pretty decent, I think he's a bronze or silver rated driver in, his team. I think he's won Bathurst in the Pro-Am category. So like, that's pretty cool. So, but other than that, I'm trying to think of just other interesting ringers that we might be forgetting. But I'm sure people will remind us what we forgot. But
yeah, we'll be
the
like,
other thing I was going to ask you is, who are some sleeper full-time drivers that people don't think of that were actually good on road courses? People, oh, you know who we forgot? PJ Jones. We completely forgot about PJ Jones.
I
the
don't
man
think
who was jack of all trades, master of none.
PJ Jones is not a ringer. I'm sorry. He's like that NASCAR guy. You just call it and be like, hey, can you make the race for us? Maybe. Oh, I like you, PJ. You're hired.
Robbie Gordon got suspended. He drove his car at Pocono. I was like, of all the drivers you could think of, you hired PJ Jones. Like,
short list.
Whatever. Yeah.
Hey, it's Parnelli Jones to you, sir. I'm trying to think about any other Cup drivers that would be really good really considered good road course racers. I think Truex has always been like the sleeper,
so
like underrated. Like you can't.
He won at Mexico in 05. Like people forget that he won a Busch race in Mexico, man. Like,
yeah,
he was really.
I think what it was in the Cup Series, DEI did not have the equipment when he jumped to Cup to be that successful on the road course races, and it just didn't pan out for him, unfortunately. And then he finally got with Michael Waltrip Racing, and I think when he got with Michael Waltrip, it was kind of good because it was that time when Michael was also racing sports cars in Italy with Brian Vickers, so he probably learned some stuff to translate back over to his cars with Rob Coughlin and be like, yeah, let's make them like the Ferraris in the Ferrari Challenge. Ferrari Challenge. So they made Cup cars more like Ferrari Challenge cars, and that's how Truex became the best. The end. Truex is good, but
I think like there's some guys that you don't think of that have won on road courses. Like Mike Bliss won a truck race on a road course. Joe Ruttman won on a road course.
The boss on road courses. He runs several truck races. Jack Sprague, Ron Hornaday. We got to think of those guys there.
Yeah, Hornaday and Todd Bodine as well is another interesting one. The Bodine brothers were all good on road courses.
Yeah, Todd had really good success too in the 90s when he had to qualify his way into races. He would start really well at like Watkins Glen. They just had a knack for that track. Steve Park was also a good road course racer. He was pretty good at Watkins Glen.
And we're forgetting Magic Shoes, Mike McLaughlin.
Oh, good old Magic.
He was always good on road courses. He would smoke people at Watkins Glen.
I think Mark Martin is going to go down as one of the most underrated road course drivers because we don't see the same numbers that we should have seen from him because he had to go up against guys like Jeff Gordon and Tony Stewart who kind of like took the baton from him because it was like this changing of the guards. It was like Ricky Rudd was good, then Rusty Wallace, then Mark Martin, then Jeff Gordon, then Tony Stewart. Then it was like an eclectic mix after that. Now you kind of have like Kyle Busch, Chase Elliott, Martin Truex Jr. As those drivers that you always have to come top of mind. Denny Hamlin, I think, is another good one we don't really mention that often.
Yeah, he is actually really good. Like he won the race at Mexico in 06.
He's won at Watkins Glen. And he came close at Sonoma until Tony Stewart bumped him out of the way. So he's He's a good driver there. Man, that's gonna be fun whenever they do the esports racing on the road course.
Oh, I'm excited. I can't wait to see guys just beating and banging.
Send it. I'm just gonna
Really
send it.
love that Jimmy Johnson's doing the IndyCar stuff in iRacing. I think that's really cool that he's doing that, like and they're letting him do it. They're like, "Yeah, sure, come along, do your thing." And
We don't
you know,
care. NASCAR's like, no Xfinity guys. Please, no. No, stop. Stop the press, please, no.
yeah, they got to let more Xfinity guys in there, man, I'm telling you.
All the
Are they
truck
going to
guys.
let ringers in for the iRace? Are they going to let like Allmendinger in and like
Oh man. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine like a lot of the like
imagine Ron
top
Fellows on a sim rig?
imagine some of the tops like actual sim racers trying their hand at that uh with like some of the top like IMSA drivers and they're all like racing stock cars. Like they're not racing anything else, just stock cars. That'd be funny.
That would be amazing. I'd be down
That'd
for
be
that, man. Like they got to figure it out. They got to make the iRacing a little bit better. It's the product's just not that great, and hopefully when they do road courses, they'll let some interesting drivers give it a try. Maybe some IndyCar guys. Like it would be a slam dunk if they let Will Power, Scott Dixon, or people come and run it. It would be really cool.
You know what I'd love to see? Like instead of like Penske games, like if Roger Penske got all of his drivers together and like they all did like a
iRock. They just did iRock.
kind of like IROC, but like they all just do everything. So like you have them do some supercar races, you have them do some NASCAR races, you have them do some open wheel like IndyCar races. Like just pit them against each other, put them all in the same car, same setup, and just have fun with it.
That would be cool.
Yeah, who's the
But
best?
I think that kind of ends our chat about road course ringers. We kind of went off on a bunch of different tangents, and it wasn't really scripted or put together well. But that's the whole point of having an unscripted chat. If you want the full history of road course ringers, check out the video about road course ringers. But this is just the unscripted chat where we just rapping, man, and that's what we do. So, yeah, you can check out Flashback to the Track, obviously here on YouTube. We're also on Spotify, so you can check us out there if you want to download us and take us with you. If you're like me and you like to listen to podcasts when you go running or when you're commuting, which none of you are doing because you're not allowed to commute right now. But I feel like podcasts are actually going way down in listenership because people aren't commuting or sitting at their desk working.
No, no,
So
they're still sitting at their desks working. Especially if you're working from home, you're sitting at a desk like mine behind me, and you
true.
just
Yeah.
work. Yeah.
But if you're like me, if you're a video editor, you can't really listen to podcasts while you're working. So, but I listen to podcasts when I go running, when I go on long runs. I just prefer that, and it's cool. So check us out on Spotify. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's weird because our YouTube channel is called Flashback to the Track, but on Twitter I'm at Facts NASCAR, and on Twitter James is.
I want to believe NASCAR, but I guess we should start making our flashback to the track accounts more visible again.
Yeah, we'll get on that. I was
Yeah.
seriously considering just changing just closing the Flashback to the Track Twitter account and then just changing my handle to Flashback Track. I was considering doing that. I'll think about it,
You'll think about it.
but we'll see. So I think we'll be fine. Guys, love doing this kind of stuff. We're going to keep doing these videos in the meantime. We might even do them more often because we have some more free time now. So
Hmm.
yeah, it's cool. Just stay safe, guys. Stay home. Stay in your house. Don't be stupid. Don't go out until your government says you're allowed. Hopefully everybody's doing well and whatnot. Wash your hands. Practice good hygiene. Don't breathe if you don't have to. That's the big one. Just don't breathe.
Don't breathe on other people, but just
Don't
listen
breathe
to your
on other
doctors.
Only
Check
leave
it
your
for
house.
Andretti.
Check it for Andretti. That's the
Check
big
it for
one.
Andretti.
So
Yeah.
thanks for watching, guys. We appreciate it. We'll see you next time.
Have a good one.